House of the Dragon. Those of you that have been watching my videos from the very beginning may know that I have been critical of this show from the very first episode. Season 1 was so different from the source material that it was almost unrecognizable, and filled with one-dimensional characters, bad writing and original content. And out of sheer hope for the future, I once said it was just about worth a passing grade. But the signs for a disastrous continuation of this series were there for all to see. But for 2 years, I felt as if I was standing alone in this regard. And I was told many times that I was too negative, and that Season 1 was a masterpiece, on par with the earlier seasons of Game of Thrones. But Season 2 of House of the Dragon has opened many people's eyes, most prominent among them the creator of the known world himself. Originally, I wanted to use this video to speak about the possibility that George had given up on House of the Dragon. Back in the beginning of July, I had found something interesting in one of George's blog posts that everyone else seemed to have missed. But while I was busy working on the Valyria series, George kept throwing more and more shade at House of the Dragon, until, on Monday the 4th of September, he did something very out of character. He wrote and published something in a very short amount of time, giving us his now deleted blog, Beware the Butterflies. I think that at this point, the majority of you guys have read this blog post yourself. And if you haven't, you have probably watched one of the dozens of YouTube videos made about it. So today, we're not going to spend the entire video dissecting this blog post phrase by phrase. I don't think that would be very interesting to any of us. We are going to look at it briefly though, because the fact that he focuses so much on the blood and cheese scene is very interesting. Interesting because this scene perfectly illustrates where it all went wrong for House of the Dragon. At the very beginning, when they failed to adapt the essence of the book they had been granted to use as source material. But before we dive deeper, I want to give a spoiler warning for both Fire and Blood and the upcoming 2 seasons of House of the Dragon. If you want to remain unspoiled, please click away now. As said before, George's criticism in his blog post is focused mainly on the blood and cheese scene, at the end of the 2nd season's 1st episode. In Fire and Blood, this is one of the most horrific and monumental events in the Targaryen civil war. The version we got in the series, however, has both been watered down and altered heavily compared to the original. A quick reminder of what happened in House of the Dragon. In the show, 2 criminals called Blood and Cheese are hired by Daemon Targaryen to infiltrate the Red Keep. Their goal is to kill Aemond Targaryen as revenge for the death of Lucerys Velaryon. And if they can't find him, they are to kill Aegon's son Jaehaerys. When they reach the bedroom where Jaehaerys and his twin sister Jaehaera are sleeping, they find Queen Helaena there as well. With a knife to her throat, Helaena is forced to show Blood and Cheese which one of her children is her son, as the 2 siblings, being twins, look very much alike. The queen offers a necklace in place of her son's life, but to no avail. In the end, she points out her son. Blood and Cheese saw off Jaehaerys' head and leave the castle. Helaena and her daughter flee to Alicent's quarters, where the Dowager Queen is making love to Sir Criston Cole, after which the queen quite calmly tells her mother that they killed the boy. In Fire and Blood, this scene plays out very differently, and the most important alterations that George discusses regarding this scene have to do with a character that was cut from House of the Dragon. Because Aegon and Helaena have 3 children. Their twins, Jaehaerys and Jaehaera, and their younger son, Maelor. And it is Maelor's absence that completely changes this scene. In the book, Blood and Cheese are enlisted by Daemon to kill one of Aegon's sons, not specifically Aemond or Jaehaerys. They sneak into the castle as they do in the show, and they secretly enter Queen Alicent's chambers. It was Helena's custom to visit her mother with her children each night before bed. Blood and Cheese were aware of this habit, and they used it to their advantage. After entering, they strangled Alicent's bedmate, and the Dowager Queen herself was bound and gagged. And then they waited. When dusk fell over the city, Queen Rolaena and her 3 children unsuspectingly entered Alicent's chambers. Upon entry, Blood killed the Queen's guardsman, while Cheese picked up young Maelor. And then the 2 criminals gave the Queen a choice. They were only hired to kill one son, so she could pick which one she wanted to lose. Desperate to save her children, Rolaena offered her own life, but Blood and Cheese were not convinced. It had to be a son. After the criminals threatened to rape the young Jaehaera and kill all of Rolaena's children if she does not choose fast, the Queen picked her younger son, Maelor. Cheese whispered in the boy's ear, "You hear that, little boy? Your mama wants you dead." After which Blood chopped off Jaehaerys' head with a single blow. The 2 criminals left the castle through the secret passageways, leaving a screaming Rolaena behind. In his now deleted blog, George mainly concentrates on what Maelor's absence and the consequential changes to this scene mean for the future of House of the Dragon. Hence the reason why his blog is called Beware the Butterflies. For those of you unfamiliar with the term, the butterfly effect revolves around the principle that a very small initial change can result in large differences in a later state. Maelor may just have been a 2-year-old child, but his death in the book sets in motion a series of events that will eventually lead to the deaths of Rolaena, 5 dragons, and Rhaenyra herself. But besides these butterflies, George mentions one more thing that he doesn't like about the series version of the Blood and Cheese scene. And that's the fact that in the show, Rolaena offers a necklace in place of her son's life, where in the book, she offers her own life instead. This change takes away Rolaena's finest moment, a show of courage and strength from a mother, who is now simply portrayed as a highborn snob trying to buy her son's life with jewelry. And it is this particular change that I find the most interesting. Because if we look closely at this change, we can see that it is part of a pattern. But to see that pattern, we have to take a look at the changes George didn't mention in his blog. Because a lot more had to be altered to accommodate this scene as we got to see it. Better yet, we can find 5 more changes in this scene and the parts of the story flowing directly to and away from it. The first change is the romantic relationship between Alicent Hightower and Sir Criston Cole. In the book, this does not happen. There aren't even rumors about a possible relationship between the two. In Fire and Blood, Alicent is happily waiting for her grandchildren to come and wish her good night before the Blood and Cheese scene happens. In House of the Dragon, she is having intercourse with an anointed knight of the Kingsguard, painting her as a harlot and Sir Criston as an oathbreaker. The second change has to do with the introduction of Aegon's twins. In contrast to Rhaenyra's children, who were all introduced to us in Season 1, with her 3 oldest even getting major screen time, Aegon's children are not named until right before one of them is killed. To make up for this fact, the young Jaehaerys is suddenly introduced to us in Season 2, because we at least need to know him a little before he is killed off. The show uses these moments to insinuate that Aegon is a bad father, who never showed any interest in his children until he became king, and Jaehaerys the heir to the throne. In the book, however, there are no mentions whatsoever that Aegon was a bad parent. The third change has to do with Helena's reaction to her son's death. In the book, Rolaena goes mad after the Blood and Cheese scene. Firstly, because she saw her son's head being chopped off before her very eyes. Secondly, because she chose her younger son to die. Out of pure guilt, she is not even able to look at Maelor anymore after this happens. In the show, however, she reacts very unlike a mother who has just seen her child be killed, walking to Alicent's quarters and sharing the news of her son's death seemingly with little emotion, and later stating that she feels that she ought to not feel bad about Jaehaerys' death, as children die all the time. Rolaena is already portrayed as being mad in the show, which is not in accordance with her book counterpart at all. But these scenes, with her emotionless reaction to her son's death, only add to that perception. And her reaction immediately leads us to the fourth change. As said before, in the book Helena goes mad after the blood and cheese scene. She refuses to eat, to bathe, and even to leave her chambers. This effectively removed her as a threat, as she was no longer able to be counted as a dragon rider on the side of the Greens. Because this doesn't happen in the show, we get the weird scenes at the end of Season 2 where Aemond is trying to force Helena to join him in an attack on Harrenhal, painting Aemond as much more of a villain than he is supposed to be, and painting Helena as weak, denying to fight in the war without having an actually good reason for it, and once again emphasizing the infighting on the side of the Greens, which is completely absent in Fire and Blood. And that brings us to the last change. The fact that House of the Dragon shows us that Rhaenyra was not involved in Jaehaerys' murder, or knew nothing about it. This is blatantly untrue. In the book, she might not have been the one to orchestrate it, but she was definitely aware of what was about to happen. Because Daemon sent a letter to Dragonstone upon hearing the news of Lucerys' death, bearing the message, "An eye for an eye, a son for a son. Lucerys shall be avenged." Nor is there any notion in the book that Rhaenyra disagreed with Daemon's methods, or the murder itself. Now I'm going to give you a second to think about the following question. What do all these 6 changes have in common? If your answer is that they all favor one side of the story, I would say you are correct. And that is exactly the reason why the blood and cheese scene is such a good example of one of House of the Dragon's biggest problems. Because the series heavily favors the side of Rhaenyra and the Blacks, but the source material and the Dance of the Dragons itself is not such a one-sided story. If you're still watching at this point and you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like so the video can get some traction. A couple of days ago we reached the goal of 10,000 subscribers, and I am so very grateful to all of you for your support. Thank you very much, truly. Do you know why I like Fire and Blood so much? First of all, because it is a history book, and I love history books. But more importantly, and this is especially relevant for the part of the book that tells us the story of the Dance of the Dragons, because it tells us the Targaryen history from both sides. Do you know how rare it is to read anything at all in our day and age that tells both sides of a story? We only have to look at our mainstream media to see this problem. Everything you read is told from a certain perspective, be it left or right. I remember that as a teenager, I could find news websites that just gave you the news. No opinions, no things being left out on purpose to paint the situation in a certain way, just the facts. But sadly, modern media have devolved to a point where this no longer seems possible. And the same can be said for history books. But history books have been one-sided for a much longer time than our modern media, especially the history that tells of periods of war. And there's an important reason for that. Because history is written down by the winner of a military conflict. When we learn about the Second World War in school, we are taught about all the awful things that Hitler and his Nazi party have done. If Hitler would have won the war, we would now be taught about all the awful things the Americans and the Jewish people had done. And I would now be speaking to you in German. Fire and Blood, however, is not a one-sided book. And there are 2 reasons for that. The first is that the Dance of the Dragons did not have a definitive winner. There are those who would say that Aegon won the war, as he killed his half-sister and reclaimed King's Landing. There are those who would say that the Blacks won the war, as Aegon the Younger would eventually sit the Iron Throne. But these people would do well to remember that at this point, Aegon the Younger was not only Rhaenyra's heir, but also Aegon's, as all other male Targaryens were dead. All in all, whichever side you think won the war, it was a Pyrrhic victory. The second reason has to do with how Fire and Blood, especially the segment concerning the Dance of the Dragons, was written. The author of the book is Archmaester Gyldain. There is some confusion as to when Gyldain exactly lived, but what we do know is that it was long after the war had run its course, which means that the Archmaester did not witness the events of the Civil War himself. So he had to rely on the writings of others to create his book. And we know that he used a total of 3 sources. Firstly, he based his book on Grandmaster Munken's The Dance of the Dragons, a true telling. Munken became Grandmaster right after the Targaryen Civil War, and was the successor to Grandmaster Orwal. Because Munken was in Oldtown for the entire duration of the war, he could not base his writings on his own accounts of the Dance of the Dragons. And that's why he relied very heavily on Orwal's written accounts of the Civil War. Orwal wrote his account of the war, however, when he was imprisoned and waiting for his execution, under the rule of King Aegon III. Because of this, his writings are known to favor Rhaenyra, the king's mother, over Aegon II, and they are known to contain quite some inaccuracies. So Archmaester Gyldain did not want to rely on Munken's and Orwal's accounts alone. And that's why for his second source, Gyldain used Septon Eustace's book, The Reign of King Viserys, first of his name, and The Dance of the Dragons that came after. Septon Eustace, who we see briefly in House of the Dragon during Aegon's coronation, served as the primary Septon in King's Landing during the reigns of Viserys I, Aegon II, and Aegon III, until he was relieved of his position because of political reasons. Because of his proximity to the royal family during the Civil War, his account is based on his own experiences of this time period. However, just as was the case with Grandmaesters Munken and Orwal, Septon Eustace's account is also not considered impartial, as he is said to have favored Aegon over Rhaenyra. The third source Archmaester Gyldain used is a wildcard, the testimony of Mushroom, an account by the court jester about his time spent at the courts of Viserys, Rhaenyra, Aegon II, and Aegon III. Mushroom's account is often believed to contain the most falsehoods, but his version of events sometimes is considered true. Also, out of the 3 sources used, Mushroom's account is the most salacious, and to us readers, outright humorous. But even here we have to note, and Archmaester Gyldain concludes this himself as well, that Mushroom's account greatly favors Rhaenyra, as he loved her well. And Mushroom only spent a couple of months in Aegon II's court, where he spent many years in the courts of Rhaenyra and Aegon the Younger. So his claims about events happening at the Green Court can often be dismissed. With these 3 sources at his disposal, Archmaester Gyldain wrote The Princess and the Queen, also known as The Blacks and the Greens, which is the official name for the part of Fire and Blood that discusses the Dance of the Dragons. An interesting account of the Targaryen Civil War. An incredibly fun read for those of us who bought the book. But most importantly, it's a very balanced report of this historic military conflict, which is quite unique when we compare it to our real-world counterparts. And the way in which Gyldain wrote the history of the Dance of the Dragons presents itself to us, the reader, in the following ways. In some cases, all the sources agree with each other, which is then presented to us as facts. In other cases, Gyldain weighs the different versions of events and favors one based on logic. Sometimes only one of the sources reports on a certain event, which is then presented to us with Gyldain's approval or concerns. And from time to time, Gyldain simply presents us with the different options and leaves the choice to the reader, making for a very balanced account of the Targaryen Civil War. With source material like this, you would expect a very balanced adaptation, a series that shows both sides of the conflict, with characters that are morally grey, making us constantly doubt which side we should root for. So why is it that House of the Dragon is not a balanced story? Why is the series so biased towards Rhaenyra and the Blacks? Well, foremost, because the showrunners chose every version of events that favored Rhaenyra. And on top of that, because they outright changed events that were known to be facts in Fire and Blood, or made them up when they didn't exist, to paint Rhaenyra and her faction in an even better light. The sexual relationship between Alicent and Sir Criston Cole, for example. The fact that Rhaenyra knew nothing of the murder of the young Jaehaerys. Having Helaena offer jewelry to save her son, instead of her own life. And please keep in mind that these examples are just the ones that are connected to the blood and cheese scene. I could make another 2-hour video about all the other things that were changed in this series. Changed to make Rhaenyra's side look good and Aegon's side look bad. The fact that Laenor did not die in Season 1 comes to mind. He most certainly did. And it is persistently rumored that Rhaenyra was the one that orchestrated it. The fight between Sir Criston Cole and Sir Joffrey Lonmouth. Changed from a thorny mishap to outright murder. The ridiculous notion that Rhaenys, the queen who never was, escaped King's Landing with her dragon and could have ended it all, but that she didn't out of some false sense of honor. The examples are truly countless. House of the Dragon's bias towards Rhaenyra and the Blacks is one of the show's biggest problems. It has changed a balanced story into a one-sided one, and it has transformed interesting and grey characters into one-dimensional NPCs, giving us a mediocre Season 1 and an awful Season 2. And if George is to be believed, the worst is yet to come, as he warns for larger and more toxic butterflies if the showrunners persist in their choices, which is such a shame when we look at the source material, because House of the Dragon could truly have been something awesome, a worthy successor to the first 4 seasons of Game of Thrones. And it pains me to see that the showrunners wasted its potential. One very important question we haven't asked ourselves today is, why? Why were the storylines changed so drastically? Why did the showrunners choose to favor Rhaenyra's side over Aegon's? I promise you that we're going to get back to that question in a future video, because I have a couple of notions why House of the Dragon became what it is, but I want to discuss those topics in full in a series of separate videos. For now, I'm curious about your opinion about House of the Dragon's first 2 seasons. Do you dislike what they have done to the source material, as I do? Or do you like what you've seen so far? Please let me know in the comments. As always, thank you guys very much for watching. See you next time.